Hey everyone! So, in the past few weeks, I've come across and talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people have thrown out some of these great buzzwords like decoupled and headless CMS. And I was actually wondering, okay, do they actually know what it means? Do I know what it means? So actually, I invited one of our trusted partners, Bright IT, to help me answer a few of my questions that I gathered along the way. And welcome, Klaus. Thanks for taking the time.
Hi.
Hey, shall we start?
Yeah, so thanks. Let's get straight into it.
Perfect. So what is actually a headless CMS, and is it completely different to like a normal CMS?
Yeah, no, it's not completely different, at least not from an offering perspective. The principal mechanics of a CMS are always the same from an editing perspective. If you put it in simple terms, the purpose of a CMS is create, process, and display content. Create resembles the offering side of the CMS, so the interface that you work with as an editor day to day, where all the contents are created, edited, deleted, and so on, with all the roles, permissions, review workflows, translation mechanisms, asset management, whatnot, what you need to work with your content. And processing is essentially the aggregation of information in order to then transform it for display. So aggregation meaning that you pick the right press releases to show on a page, right? You want to have the 5 latest press releases, so you will aggregate information in that sense. And then you transform it for display.
Okay, so does this process differ between a standard and a headless CMS?
So what differs is actually the processing and displaying part. So when you look at a standard CMS, there are two common approaches. There are traditional, it's labeled traditional CMS and decoupled CMS. So I will come back to what that means. But you will typically have a presentation layer in such systems. So the presentation layer is responsible for the generation of web pages or other output channels directly by the CMS. So the CMS itself is responsible for transforming the data into something that can be looked at, let's say. During editing, you will also sometimes work in a more page-based model, not in all systems, but in some of them, or as is the case in BloomReach, even if you can work with content independently, there always is some kind of visual presentation available in direction of the end user of the website or solution you're building. In general, there are two traditional CMS approaches, coupled or decoupled. So coupled is often also called the traditional model. A coupled system means that you work in the same system for editing content and serving that information that you're editing in a processed way to end users. So it's one system. Decoupled simply means that you have one system for offering and another one for serving that information, and there is a process in between where you synchronize content. So often there will be the publish button in the CMS. And then you synchronize the data to another service that will process and display it. So a headless CMS in comparison does all the things that a standard CMS does with regards to editing. So all your content creation, editing, and also publishing will be done in some offering backend that you use as an editor. But when it comes to serving that data to the end user, we do not care about the layout and design of that, but we simply serve that more or less raw. It can be aggregated actually. There can be search queries that I'm sending to the CMS. So give me the latest 5 press releases and order them by date would be a query. And then the headless CMS gives me back a feed of the content, a raw interface basically I have. So a headless CMS does not generate any HTML.
Okay, perfect. So can you give me examples to make it easier to grasp?
Sure, let's have a look at 2 simple examples. Example 1. As mentioned, a standard CMS is often page or at least output oriented. So the CMS takes the data stored in the CMS and transforms it into custom client-specific HTML to describe the layout and content of the pages, which is then of course combined with custom style sheets for design and custom JavaScript for behavior. Example 2. The headless CMS looks very different. The data stored in the CMS will be made available as raw content through a standardized technical interface. And the headless CMS may of course aggregate and filter the data as it is needed for presentation, but it will not generate the HTML. And it doesn't really care about the details of your layout and design which the data is used in. There are variants that are actually somewhere in between those two examples that are a little bit strict, but I suggest not to go further down that route because it doesn't matter for the principal understanding of what a headless CMS is.
Okay, so does that mean everyone should now switch to a headless CMS?
There is no simple answer to that question. The headless CMS movement has definitely been growing for some time now. So that's why you're reading about that all over the place. However, it's not a fit for everyone and every project. Although, if you are managing digital customer experiences across multiple channels and at a certain scale or level of complexity, then headless is relevant. We're talking mainly about things like number of channels you run, the amount of content or products you have, and so on. When you serve the same content across multiple channels and you want to keep all those channels really in sync, headless should definitely be on your agenda. Sometimes the headless topic is also pushed by developers, as it can reduce their exposure to the very custom tools and platforms. So when you have a custom presentation layer in a CMS, it also means that they need to learn how to work with that. There is a certain process to make updates within that environment, that's a very specific environment. And that's simply a major factor in complexity, risk, and uncertainty for developers. So many developers will propagate moving towards more headless architectures. One requirement on the other hand side that would speak clearly against a purely headless CMS is visual editing, or the lack of that. Because with headless, it's not impossible, but it's very hard to achieve visual editing. So that is particularly true for very marketing-oriented, design-rich and highly customized websites. So when presentation is in focus and not content, I mean, content is always important, but when you adapt your content to the presentation thereof, then you probably want visual editing, right? A good indicator generally of how headless your CMS should be is the amount of structured content that you have and generally the complexity of your content model. So when it's very granular and non-standardized, then probably you're not going to benefit much from headless capabilities. But when you're dealing with a volume of product information or other structured information, then it probably makes sense and you should look at that.
Okay, perfect. So can you give me some specific use cases when to use a headless CMS?
Yeah, so as mentioned, headless is extremely useful in any setup where you intend to feed multiple channels with your content, typically beyond just the standard website. Imagine you have a product catalog that is published to your website, but also to a dedicated mobile application. Assuming maybe that you have the product catalog made available to your sales force, together with additional information like pricing, let's say, that you don't want to show on your website. But it's clear that you want to keep the product data absolutely in sync. So this is one of the key requirements these days, that your customers expect that you are giving them the same accurate information across all channels at all times. So one unified customer experience. And that comes with data, that comes with all the processes aligned. So you don't want to deal with 10 systems feeding that in a custom way. Even if you manage to do that successfully, you will it comes at very high cost. It comes at differences. It comes, for the end customer, there's always disadvantages. Or think of very special dedicated devices like point of sales. When you want to feed those from your CMS, then you probably don't want to deal with creating some very custom output for that particular channel, but rather you want to provide a standardized interface for data exchange with your CMS. And that is exactly what a headless CMS solves. So it's about effort and speed here. And speaking of which, this is generally a reason for the rise of headless approaches. We see a substantial increase in speed in our industry, meaning number of changes and expected delivery time for those. Your typical digital customer experience in that sense has really changed. When you think about 10 years ago, I've been doing this for around about 15 years at least. And I remember in the old days, you would launch a website and leave it almost abandoned for some time. I mean, that doesn't exist anymore. If you go live, what it means is you do a redesign. So maybe there's a new strategy on how you present certain things, or you're simply improving the digital customer experience. And then you want to continuously adjust that. I mean, we're talking about, quick testing and changes. So how are you going to do that? The more complex your setup is, the more difficult it will be for you to achieve that. Yeah, and everything, another example would be everything that is highly standardized on the content side, but changes a lot on the presentation side. So I'm thinking of clients, and we do have such clients, that run a huge number of campaigns globally, and the content in structure could be really standardized. Then a headless approach makes sense, because you can completely detach the problem of restyling things and adapting it to individual brands or markets from the content side. And that is a huge speed advantage. For developers, in this particular case, it means that they always have some sample content to work with. So even though maybe the marketing department is still working out the campaign content, developers can already implement a custom design and custom behavior, because everything is already defined on the content level. And I have a standard interface for that. And I don't have the complexity of doing this in a complex CMS setup.
Okay, great. And I think the next question you should ask me, but I want to hear your opinion about this. Why do you think BloomReach evolved into a headless system? Why do you think there was a need for such a system?
Yeah, so I think evolving is the wrong term, because since a very long time, BloomReach has been following this approach of segregation or separation of content and presentation. So there has always been a split there. So evolving in the sense means more that the addition of purely headless capabilities is, I couldn't tell exactly when it was added, but it's been there for a while. And what makes BloomReach very interesting for any customer seeking a CMS with headless capabilities is that you get the full range of capabilities in one platform. So what does that mean? You can, on the one hand side, work with this very page-centric visual approach. So you can have smaller campaigns or even your entire website run by that if you want. In principle, you do have a separation of content and presentation. So if you're working in a model or parts of your assets are in direction of a lot of content that should be managed as content, independent from presentation, you have it out of the box. And then we're talking about headless, which comes in two flavors with BloomReach. One is a special single-page application feed. I will come back to that. And the fully flavored headless approach. So you have all of it in one system. And I would like to maybe come back to the single-page application headless functionality, because it's quite interesting. So this is something that you want to use for creating dedicated sort of, for example, mobile applications. So we use this for special purpose mobile applications that we do not want to develop as native iOS or Android applications. It's a speed question simply. It's a complexity and speed question. So updating that, going to different technology is not desirable, especially when it's not your main channel. And you want to be able to quickly develop something like that. So it's now possible to create websites that behave like a mobile application on your mobile browser. They will instantly work on iPhone and Android phones. You can immediately test them. You don't have to go through this whole App Store or Google Play Store process. You can continuously update that as needed. So for us, it's a very good approach to solve this smaller application problem, or even more complex. You can have interaction there. So you will have all the navigation, any forms that you need. You can use the camera of the phone. These days, it's possible to do many of the business applications in that way. And for that, you have a special output in BloomReach. So sorry for talking so much about this one feature, but I think it's actually quite a practical thing, and you can make use of that instantaneously.
So that was a really good overview. Now, just to finish it up, it would be great if you could just give like an elevator pitch on what a headless CMS is, because we've talked about so much now, and like just a summary of the whole headless approach would be great. Right.
Yeah. So I think the main point about headless is that you get an interface to your data that is independent from presentation. And this is relevant for use cases where you want to obviously integrate your data into other systems, when you want to work with the data without touching the CMS. And it's relevant for speed and flexibility.
Perfect. That's a really good summary. Thank you very much.